When a parent dies, there is an overall sense of acute and sometimes shallow loss, an empty space where they once were. But I think it's in those singular shared moments and memories that go with them where the true loss lies. So this is a small story about my mother, who died on the 26th of February 2015, and with whom I had a complicated and not entirely successful relationship throughout teenagedom and into adulthood. My mother often saw life through the lens of how it related specifically to her. At its worst, she could be somewhat self-centered, missing the trees for her own forest. At its best, it resulted in a kind of empathetic fury. A slight on one of her children was a slight on her, which didn't always take into account the slight on her child, but it did give her a burning sense of righteous rage. Between my 4th and 6th year of secondary school, I was a self-conscious, gawky, somewhat ugly stowaway, neither stupid enough to be considered a washout by my teachers, nor smart enough to encourage. I was just there. I didn't know how to socialize and wasn't quite able to maintain friendships. To others, I appeared strange. As a result of all of this, I was also cruelly bullied for, as it turns out, my autistic tendencies in a bleakly neurotypical and typically working-class Scottish secondary school of the 90s. Not just put through acute psychological torture by a huge number of my peers, who at least had the excuse of being teenagers, but unfortunately by several of my teachers. Adults who realized they could win points in class by singling me out for painful ridicule, the cinder-glowing after-effects of which have scorched into my own adult life. By 6th year, I was suffering suicidal ideation and increasingly violent, intrusive thoughts that had begun to result in a kind of vicious acting out at home. I had become an angry, anxious, volatile, and terribly sad young man, attempting to hide it by masking, until finally that overstretched rubber band of hidden negative emotions snapped. A violent incident against my brothers was the catalyst. A sudden and terrible moment of anger that frightened both them and myself. Before I knew it, I was pouring my heart out to my befuddled mother and father, both of whom had started by taking me to task, and neither of whom could quite believe what they were now hearing, nor reconcile it with who they'd thought I was. Hugely smart, devastatingly good-looking, greatly popular, and adept at all things. In short, their child, who I was describing. This wasn't their child. How could it be? Instead, what they were presented with was a child in a freefall meltdown that had been going on for 3 years. A boy who was drowning under the weight of a revilement he could barely understand. Both parents reacted with a kind of defensiveness. My father could never quite get past his own misunderstanding that a bullied man must be doing something to deserve it. His solution was that I should lash out physically, something he would beat himself up over much later in life. My mother, who had grown up in a tough working-class borough of Dublin, with like 50 brothers and sisters or something, understood that I was beaten down, psychologically, but felt that she had somehow been at fault for not seeing it sooner. She was heartbroken with what she perceived as her failing. And within a few days of this chaos is when the school discovered my truancy. See, for 5 months, I had perfected a way of playing truant without it being picked up on, turning up after registration and signing a late form. The register was sent to classes with me as absent, but as far as the school knew, I was just late. I mean, obviously it was going to come back and bite me on the crack. So the deputy headmaster telephoned my family home to tell my mother what was what. He bustled and bristled haughtily that I didn't take my education seriously, which I didn't. And if I thought I could get one over on the school, then I was sadly mistaken, which I mean I had, at least for 5 months. He'll be lucky, continued this swelled-up gland of a man, not to be expelled. Which is when my mother verbally reached down that phone line, grabbed him by the throat, and shook him to the ground, pulled her hand back out so that she could fit her foot through, and stomped him into submission. I'm guessing this was the catalyst she had been waiting for, a moment for her to retaliate against the subjugation and depression I'd been experiencing because of that school, to atone in her mind for her own neglect. How dare you telephone my home and talk about my son like that? Have you any idea what he's been going through in your school? Do you have any idea of who he even is? He dies 1,000 deaths every time he has to walk through those doors because of the way he is bullied there by your students and your teachers. If he doesn't take education seriously, it's because he's been given no reason to. He dies 1,000 deaths every single day, so can you blame him for not wanting to be there? I don't. And he will not be going back into those classes until his exams. And on the other side, all I could hear was a cowed and cowardly man who thought he'd had the upper hand because he was a bastion of education, speaking down to a silly little lass from Dublin. A squeaked facsimile of a tinny voice repeating over and over and over under my mother's fired-up rebuke.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I'm sorry.
This is a moment I have never forgotten. A moment I would hope this bubble-burst smug little prick of a man, probably dead too, thought a lot about himself. And it was a moment that exemplified my mother. My mother was always the loudest laugh in the room, the proudest of our achievements. She was the first to congratulate and commiserate, and the first to remind you she had a birthday coming up and that she'd like jewellery this time instead of flowers. So yes, we had a strained relationship, and I do believe it's partly because of what I put her through during one of the darkest periods in my life and what she thought it potentially said about her. But despite that, she was also the person who took my side when I needed it most, who didn't judge me for what I was going through and where it could have taken me. And she was the one who verbally knocked 7 shades of shit out of a lousy human being, who only saw me as an inconvenience to his day, a foolish minor to be reminded of his place instead of the troubled, desperately depressed child I was. And she did this because I was her child. I was one of those trees in that forest of hers, and in that moment I felt seen by her. Yes, we had a strained relationship, but it was never truly bad. And now, well, I would love to be able to talk to her about that moment again, that singular moment in memory that we both shared.